Again, we are going to be making our way through Isaiah chapter 34, verses 11 through 17. But before we can do that, we must do what we always do. Back up, discuss what we talked about last week so that we keep everything in its proper context. Now, last week we made our way through Isaiah chapter 34, verses 6 through 10. And it's in those verses that Isaiah, it's just in this prophetic word, is laying out this bloody illustration. He talks about God using a sword to slaughter animals for a sacrifice. But this sacrifice that's taking place, it's not for atonement. For the animals are a representation of the fallen world, the world that rejects Christ. They will become the sacrifice. They will have to answer for their sins. And how are they going to answer for that? By way of eternal damnation. No. So often when we start to hear about this, we kind of start to, put on the brakes a little bit. Is this going to be one of those fire and brimstone type sermons? No, listen. There are many attributes to God. And although, yes, it is sad from the human perspective that there are going to be those that are going to pay for their sins for eternity. The destruction is going to fall on them forever. But at the same time, it's this wrath. It's one of God's attributes. It's what makes him God. And we need to understand that. We need to love that part of God as much as we love the loving part of God. But so often when we hear the wrath, we tend to cringe and want to talk about something else. And yes, that's natural, but we cannot remove the attributes of the Almighty Holy God. So yes, man, this world is going to answer for their rejection of the only begotten Son. They are going to answer for their sins against the Almighty Holy God. So here you have this image of God with this sword, and he's slaughtering these animals. And of course, the animals, once again, are the representation of the world, those who have rejected him. But Isaiah does something here. He calls out a specific sin as well. And that specific sin is against those who have gone against Christ's own people. The very ones who hate God's elect, who hate God's children. Now, who does he compare this to? During the time of Isaiah, there is the land of Edom. Now, we know that the rulers through the time period of Edom, they despised God's people. So it's here in this illustration, this poetic word that Isaiah is laying out, that he uses the sins of Edom and how they mistreated the Israelites. And he said God's vengeance are going to fall upon them, but there's a deeper layer to this. Edom is also a representation of the world during the end times. For there is going to come a time when Christ returns, and for those who have rejected Christ, they will be crushed. Now let's clarify something real quick before we jump into, before we look at verse 8 one more time. When you hear me talk about a child of God, what I'm referring to is the believer and the believer only. That's the only children of God that there are. Now there is the creation of God, and that's humanity. But not every person is a child of God. It's only those who have been regenerated. So again, everyone is a creation of God, but not all are children of God. Now let me just back up what I was talking about when it comes to Edom and how Edom despised the Israelites and how God was going to bring his vengeance upon those who hate God's children. Now look at verse 8. It said, "For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion." So we see God's vengeance is going to be laid out upon those who have not only rejected Christ, but have rejected his people. Now, let's move forward to verse 11 here. Isaiah chapter 34, look at verse 11. Now remember again, this is a poetic language in which Isaiah is going to be using. It says, "But the hawk and the porcupine shall possess it. The owl and the raven shall dwell in it. He shall stretch the line of confusion over it and the plumb line of emptiness." Now these creatures that are given here, I mean, it does seem kind of odd. We go from a porcupine to an owl and to a raven. This has caused some discussion within the theological circles. Many of theologians haven't necessarily agreed on what this actually means, but they have agreed on two things. This is what they agree upon. The very animals that are mentioned here are animals that nest in solitary places. The second thing that they agree upon is that these are considered unclean animals, animals that the Israelites were forbidden to eat. So once again, you think about the illustration that's been laid out. We've been given this city, Edom, and it was a flourishing city. But Edom was also a place that despised God and God's people. So in verse 8, that's what we went to. We hear about God's vengeance coming for those who reject God, but also for those who despise God's children. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing that there was a time in which Edom, and which is being compared to the world, Edom was a flourishing city. It was thriving. So no way these animals were going to be hanging out in this flourishing city. Why? Because they like solitude. So what does this mean? It means when God's wrath falls upon Edom, it is going to level it. It's gone. There are not going to be any people living in the city. As a matter of fact, the city is not even going to be standing. So now we have this understanding of how these solitary animals are now nesting in a place that used to be thriving. They're nesting there because it's going to be gone, eliminated. When we think about even today, and you think about this once wonderful nation that we live in, a nation that at one point in time, I don't ever believe we were a Christian nation, but I do believe our principles were Christian-based. We are a thriving nation, but we are also a nation that has rebelled against God. The same thing took place in Edom. But what happens to a place where sin is idolized, where sin is worshiped? Eventually, that sin corrupts that thriving place. We even see here that Isaiah, in his writing, he uses these tools that would normally be used when you construct a building properly. But here we see these tools being used to describe a place that is just tainted in sin. And what does sin do but corrupt? It deforms the structure of society. And sadly, when you see a place like Edom, this thriving nation that embraces sin, that rejects God, what does it produce? It produces a nation that loves sin. And when a place loves sin, rejects the good news, God's patience only stands for so long before his wrath comes for it. and in his perfect timing, the same way in which God demolished Edom, there's going to be a time where this world is going to have to answer for their sins. Now look at verse 12. It says, its nobles, there is no one there to call it a kingdom, and all its princes shall be nothing. For we know the leaders of Edom were prideful men. They looked to themselves for answers. As a matter of fact, they even created gods of their own and said, we'll get the answers from them. They never looked to the truth. They knew the very people who knew the truth, who had the truth. But they wanted nothing to do with them because they despised them. So here we understand when Edom was crushed, so went their kings, so went their rulers. Now here's something the kings, the rulers of Edom, here's what they did not recognize. Because they believed that everything was underneath their power, underneath their rule, underneath their reign. But even then, God was ruling and reigning over them. They didn't recognize it. They didn't want that truth. So here these wicked leaders are relying only upon themselves and the false gods that they created with their own hands. And eventually, Edom is going to come crashing down. Now I'm going to sound like a broken record here. But at some point in time, we truly have to start asking ourselves, how much longer can this nation that we are living in, how much longer can it last? For the very ones who are ruling over us are wicked. Many of them claim to be believers. But these same people who claim to be believers also claim that a woman has the right to kill the baby that is growing in her womb. These same leaders who claim to be believers have redefined marriage. When God has clearly stated what marriage is, and that's between a man and a woman. But even that is confusing to some of our leaders today. What is a woman? I don't know if you all know the philosopher Matt Walsh, but he's asked that question, and many of people cannot answer it. This is the world that we are living in today. This is the very nation that we are living in. What is a woman? A 3-year-old can answer that. But our leaders can't. And I'm not just talking about our governing officials. I'm talking about we have church denominations that refuse to answer that question, that have embraced the murdering of babies. So when we look at Edom, are we not almost looking at ourselves in a mirror? I saw today where the state of Kansas, a red state, has voted to keep abortion legal up to 22 weeks. I was also told that the state of Florida is being sued for their abortion law, which is up to 15 weeks. It should be abolished completely, but they're being sued by religious entities because they believe 15 weeks is not enough. Look at what happens to this land known as Edom. Verse 13. It says, thorns shall grow over its strongholds, nettles and thistles in its fortresses. It's here in this poetic writing, that you see the sins of this powerful land overtaking it. Why? Because of their wickedness. And listen, this powerful land, this Edom, it doesn't come back. Once God destroys it, it's gone forever. It'll be consumed by God's wrath. What once was will never be again. And listen, there's going to become a day and a time when Christ returns, and this is going to happen to every single powerful nation. Sadly, the leaders, the religious leaders, some of them, and even the citizens, they believe that they can't be stopped. That's what Edom thought about themselves. They thought that that was their land for them to rule over. But what they don't understand is that it's God who gave them that land for a period of time. It's God who gave those leaders that authority for a period of time. It was God who gave those religious leaders that ability to teach and preach for a period of time. And it was God who gave those citizens life in that land for a period of time. Now, what did they do with that time? We know that the land of Edom squandered it. They wallowed in their sin, never looking for the truth. And here's what we need to understand. For God is patient, but He will only stand for sin for a period of time before His justice falls. Continuing, it says, it shall be the haunt of jackals and abode for ostriches. Now we see these two animals brought up in scripture verses elsewhere. And you think that's odd, but jackals and ostriches? Yeah, they appear in other places in the Bible. Look at Job 30:29. I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. Now look at Micah 1:8. For this I will lament and wail. I will go stripped and naked. I will make lamentation like the jackals and mourning like the ostriches. So it's in both of these verses, in this illustration that's been given, we see an intense mourning taking place. And that would make sense. You think about the people in that surrounding environment when Edom comes crashing down. When that empire falls, but not just the empire, but everyone within it. Of course there is going to be mourning. Because there are going to be people who follow that wicked empire. And they will mourn for those who have been crushed, who have been destroyed. But they're not mourning for the right reasons. They're not mourning because of the destruction that waits for those very people for eternity, forever. No, they're mourning because that sin they love is no longer there. Now look at verse 14. And wild animals shall meet with hyenas. The wild goat shall cry to his fellow. Indeed, there the night bird settles and finds for herself a resting place. So what are we seeing here? I don't know, Britt, just random animals crying and screaming out. No, there really is something here. These very animals, they're desert-dwelling wild animals. They're ones that want no part of a city. So what are we seeing in this prophetic word? We're seeing once again, because of the destruction of Edom, these wild animals that normally prefer desert life will now be inhabiting that once was a thriving city. Now look at verse 15. It says the owl nests and lays and hatches and gathers her young in her shadow. Indeed, there the hawks are gathered each one with her mate. What he's doing here is he's just piling on. One verse on top of the next, on top of the next, of God's wrath, of the destruction that is coming. And really, this should be terrifying. I say it should be terrifying because this is also not just speaking of Edom, but it's pointing to what is coming. And sadly, from the understanding of Edom, what's coming is God's wrath. And here we have these owls that have been brought up. And you're thinking, okay, why owls? But this again is another animal that raises its offsprings in a place of solitude. And where are these owls going? Where are they going to be raising their families now? In what used to be this thriving metropolis. Well, where's the thriving metropolis? It's gone. So this gives us the understanding of that city that once was but is no more. Even with the hawks, once again, a desert animal, wide open spaces. Hawks aren't going to go hang out in cities. That's not their dwelling place. But that's what we're seeing here. Hawks need a place that's wide open so they can spot their prey. So now we have the owls and the hawks that have taken over a place that was once inhabited by numerous people. Now, some have even gotten a little bit more graphic when it comes to the hawks because they're carnivores. They eat live animals and dead ones. So there are some commentaries that speak on the hawks preying on the dead, eating the flesh of the people. That went a little bit too far for me, so I didn't bring it up. Now look at verse 16. It says, "Seek and read from the book of the Lord. Not one of these shall be missing. None shall be without her mate." So we're coming to the conclusion of Isaiah's poetic writing and this part of Isaiah. And what he's saying is that in the book of the Lord, all of these things are going to come to pass. This is how it's going to end for Edom, and this is how it's going to end for the world. Now you may be asking, wait a minute, but what if we do this? No. Do you not understand what we're seeing in verse 16? It's already written. Seek and read from the book of the Lord. None of these shall be missing. So we have to understand that this has already been decreed from God. And we see it's down to the finest of details. God has even determined that these creatures are going to have mates with them. So if you think about it, if he's decreed that they're going to have mates with him, can you imagine what his destruction is going to be like? It is going to be final, and we know that with Edom. When Edom was crushed, it was crushed. It never came back. So we better believe that this decreed wrath is coming for the world that has rejected him. And we see this confirmed continuing verse 16, for it says, "For the mouth of the Lord has commanded, and his spirit has gathered them." In the same way in which God promised the flood, what happened? It rained and it flooded and wiped out the entire world. In the same way in which the Israelites were promised the land of Canaan, what happened? The land of Canaan was delivered to the Israelites. The same way in which the seed was promised all the way back in Genesis 3:15. And what happened? The Messiah, the only begotten Son, was given to the world. So the same way in which all of those things came about by way of the Lord confessing it and his Spirit gathering them, this is the same destruction that is coming for the world that has rejected Christ and hated his people. Look at verse 17. This is it. It's done. It's already promised. We see it here where it says he has cast the lot for them. The dice have already been rolled. His hand has portioned it out to them with the line. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation, they shall dwell in it. Again, the lot's been cast. The world, because of their sins against the Father, will be laid to waste. It will become, poetically speaking, a desert land inhabited by unclean animals. That's all that will be left. Again, this is just giving us an illustration. It's not truly saying that there's going to be animals roaming on the earth after God has wiped it out. But you know what, Edom? Do you know what their trust was in? In themselves. It was in their government. It was in their false gods and their religious leaders. But they were never their own master. For the only reason they had power to begin with is because God gave them that power. The only reason that Edom was ruled by them is because God gave them that region. For Edom believed that they were the rulers of their own destiny. But there is only one ruler, and he determines all things, and that is the Almighty Sovereign Lord. So when the Almighty Sovereign Lord tells us to repent, to place our faith in Christ and Him alone because He is going to return, then that's what we do. We don't look to our government to protect us. We don't look at this mighty nation in which we live in to protect us. For there is only one protector and one Redeemer, and that is Christ. All right. Questions?